Our next speaker is Professor Steve Rholes. Steve is Professor of Psychology in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at Texas A&M University. He has been conducting research on adult attachment theory since 1992, and his most recent research concerns adults who have no organized way to use attachment figures to cope with distress. He and Dr. Ramona Pitzold developed a scale to measure disorganized style and have found it to be an important complement to the traditional attachment dimensions of anxiety and avoidance. His talk today is titled Attachment and the Transition to Parenthood. Please welcome Professor Rholes.
Well, I want to thank all the organizers of this particular symposium for inviting me to talk. I was really honored to be invited, and I'm pleased to be here today. I want to also acknowledge my co-authors and collaborators, Ramona Pitzold, my wife, and Jeff Simpson, my long-term friend and collaborator. Both of them contributed a great deal to the work that you'll be seeing me talk about today. I'm organizing this talk into 4 different parts. The first concerns attachment theory and the concept of attachment styles. The second part will discuss marital difficulties during the transition to parenthood as related to attachment styles. The third part will discuss opportunities for personal growth during the transition. And the fourth part will discuss new directions for research on the transition to parenthood. The origins of attachment theory. This theory began with, was originated by John Bowlby, a British child and family psychiatrist. He published books between 1969 and 1980, 3 volumes, that really defined the field of attachment theory. This theory has been carried forward by Mary Ainsworth, a student of Bowlby's, and Mary Main, a student of Mary Ainsworth's. And in the child developmental literature and in the social personality literature, it's been carried forward by, in particular, Phil Shaver and Mario Mikulinzer, who have led the efforts to apply attachment theory to romantic relationships among adults. First, okay, so let's talk about attachment styles and attachment theory and attachment styles in romantic relationships. First of all, attachment styles are defined as a pattern of behavior that individuals habitually display in romantic relationships. The 2 primary dimensions of attachment style are attachment anxiety and attachment avoidance. So based on their interactions with child caregivers, adults with more anxious styles develop a deep sense of uncertainty about their self-worth as relationship partners, and also they develop a deep sense of uncertainty about their partner's commitment to them. So they worry constantly about their partner abandoning them or not being there for them. These sorts of deep concerns lead them to behave in a variety of characteristic ways, which are clinging to their partners and insisting on demonstrations of support. They include seeking out suffocating levels of intimacy. They feel that they do not get enough support from their partners. They worry their partners will not take care of them as much as they, or do not care for them as much as they care for their partners. They tend to be jealous of potential romantic rivals, and last of all, they're highly dependent on their partners. The key to the relationship of avoidant people centers around social support. When anxious people, I confuse anxious and avoidant. I've been doing it for all my life, so I'll continue to do it throughout this. Just know what I mean. When anxious people have partners that they think are providing them with adequate social support, the relationships they have are fairly untroubled. On the other hand, when they have relationships that they think include a partner who is not sufficiently supportive, then their relationships become problematic. Why is social support so important? Well, the reason is because, first of all, it eases their concerns about their self-worth, and it eases their concerns about their partner's commitment to them. So it addresses one thing addresses two different concerns, and that's very important to the relationships of these individuals. Let's see. Let me turn to the attachment style that we call avoidance style. And based on their childhood experience, avoidant people come to fear rejection, a very strong fear of rejection. Now, rejection can't be avoided entirely, but a person can try to avoid relationships and situations in relationships in which they are highly vulnerable and would be severely hurt by rejection should it occur. So, with this deep worry about rejection leads to the following kinds of behaviors. Avoidant people try to minimize their vulnerability by acting like they're free and unencumbered, asserting that they're autonomous and that they're independent from their partners, avoiding psychological intimacy, asserting that relationships do not affect them much, not committing to their relationships very strongly. And finally, though, of all these things might suggest they don't want relationships, but they do not eschew relationships. They simply want to have relationships on their own terms, okay? The key to relationships for avoidant people it's not social support at all. They don't seek social support, and they're not really troubled by not having it. What they want to do is they try to find defensive maneuvers that will allow them to avoid vulnerability. And they're fine as long as those defenses allow them to feel as though they are invulnerable to rejection. But on the other hand, when the circumstances within the marriage or the relationship begin to break down those defenses, they begin to be troubled, and they begin to fear, at least unconsciously, that a rejection may be coming. And so the breakdown of their defenses is very troubling to them, and that's where their relationships begin to fall into disarray. So, with that as background, let's talk about my present study. The goal of this study was to investigate marital satisfaction and depressive symptoms of parents during the transition to parenthood. It was a 2-year longitudinal study, and it began from birth to age 24 months, and it included both mothers and fathers. There were approximately 180 couples to begin the study. Approximately 150 completed it, which I thought was a pretty good rate. We had some pretty serious inducements to stay in the study. If couples stayed in the study, they could earn about $600 in payment, and they could also be put in for a $1,000 gift certificate or a $1,000 award through a drawing if they continued all the way through. Couples filled out questionnaires at 5 different times, beginning at the birth, and they filled them out every 6 months up until the age of 24 months for their child. So let's first of all talk about the first analysis that we did with this data. The first analysis tested the hypothesis that was outlined above, which was that low levels of perceived spousal support would undermine the marital satisfaction of more anxious persons. So, did that happen? Here's the data. Let me get you oriented towards this figure first. On the right-hand side, you have people who perceive that their partner is supporting them strongly. That's called high actor social support. They perceive that their partners are really supportive. On the left-hand side, you have actors just the opposite, who perceive that their partners are relatively unsupportive. Now, on the y-axis is marital satisfaction, and the x-axis is actor anxiety, from on the left, low anxiety, to on the right, high anxiety, okay? And the dotted lines represent men, and the solid lines represent women. Let's look first at the left side of the graph, where we're looking at low perceived actors who perceive that their partners are not supportive, and let's look at the women and see what their responses are. Notice on the left side of the graph, when women are not very anxious, their marital satisfaction is fairly high, score about 40, 43.5. Though those women, as women become more and more anxious, their satisfaction declines quite severely in this particular condition. So this is completely consistent with what we expected. Men, on the other hand, did not fulfill our expectations. They were relatively low, as you can see, in attachment, in marital satisfaction. They kind of remained low throughout most of the, from transition from low to high. Anxiety made little difference to them. Let's look on the right side. We notice there's a little bit higher scores on satisfaction for everyone, and we notice that men and women are about the same. And we notice that from the low levels of avoidance to high levels of avoidance, there's very little change at all. In other words, low avoidant people and high avoidant people are about equally satisfied, as long as everybody perceives high levels of spousal support. Okay? So in other words, being anxious is a bad thing in some ways, but it's not always bad. There are times when anxious people have quite nice relationships. So the second analysis of study 1 basically is the same analysis that I just described, except we're switching the dependent measure. Instead of talking about satisfaction of marriage, we're going to be talking about depressive symptoms. Let's take a look. Now, this particular finding is very complicated, and I tried putting the scales and the thing. I said, nobody's ever going to understand that unless we stop for 10 minutes so everybody can analyze every little single movement on the scale. So instead of wanting to do that, I said, I'll just describe the findings. And I think that'll be clearer and simpler and quicker that way. So let's start off with high anxious people. And let's look at high anxious people who perceive lower levels of spousal support. They feel their partner's unsupportive. Women in this condition showed the highest levels of depressive symptoms in the study, or in this particular analysis, and their symptoms remained constant across the transition from birth to 24 months. They were depressed the whole time. Men, on the other hand, began at lower levels of depression but gradually increased, so that by the end of the 24-month period they had just as many depressive symptoms as women did. So under low levels of support we get exactly what we expect: high levels of depressive symptoms for anxious people. Let's look at anxious people when they perceive that their partner is very supportive. Well, you can read it yourself. They have very few problems, and their problems don't change much over the course of time. Let's look now at the low avoidant people and see what they did. We shouldn't have any problems here, really. And what we find is that with low anxious people who perceive little spousal support, notice that women, they have average levels of depression and slight decline over time. No real problems there. And for men, basically the same set of findings. So low anxious people who don't get much support are fine. They're not problematic at all. What about low anxious people who get high levels of support? Well, they're fine too. So as you can notice, and you can just read that for yourself, they generally have low levels of support, and they tend to decline, if anything, over time. Okay. So what about our third level, our third analysis? We're switching now from anxious people to avoidant people, and we're going back to marital satisfaction as our dependent measure. Again, a complex analysis that I'm just going to tell you the results from. Let's start with high anxious partners. I'm sorry. I forgot to mention. We're also changing dependent measures, independent measures, so that we're looking at high levels of child care involvement. So we're asking, how do avoidant people function in terms of marital satisfaction when they're involved in child care a great deal, or when they're involved in child care less compared to their partner? When you have highly avoidant people who are involved in high levels of child care, you have a problem, because remember, high avoidant people, number one, do not want to be caregivers, all right? And number two, want to be free, unencumbered, want to be autonomous, want to do what they want to do when they want to do it, all right? if you're involved, you've ever had children, and you've been through the transition to parenthood, you know that attitude doesn't work really very well. Okay, so these guys are going to be in a position where their defenses, those critical defenses, are going to be breaking down if they have to do a lot of child care. So they should then be unhappy with their marriages. And in fact, that's exactly what happens. With high levels of child care, men showed sharp declines in marital satisfaction, very sharp declines from birth to 24 months. They became more and more dissatisfied as when they were involved in high levels of child care. If they were involved in low levels of child care, there was not a problem so much. Both men and women showed relatively higher levels of satisfaction, slight downward trend. It's being involved in child care that is really tough, and it is tough for both men and also for, well, no, just for men who showed that decline. Women did not show the decline. I'm sorry, I don't think I put that on there. Let's look at low avoidant partners, high levels of child care. Both women and men showed high levels of satisfaction that did not change. Low levels of avoidance, low levels of child care. Both men and women showed high levels of satisfaction that did not change much over time. So our real problematic group is high levels of child care, men who show sharp declines in marital satisfaction if they have to be in child care. And just to emphasize, women did not show the same thing. I didn't write it here. Women showed high levels of satisfaction throughout. So being heavily involved in child care did not undermine their relationships, even if they were highly avoidant. So we have partial support for our hypotheses. Okay, now we're going to the fourth analysis, and this is the last analysis of this data of this particular sort. And we're looking at avoidant people and the amount of extra-familial activities that they feel were undermined by their relationships. I don't think I put that very well, but what we have is avoidant people tend to like to do a lot of things outside of their relationships. In fact, they like to be distracted from their relationships by all kinds of activities, like particularly work. All right? What happens when men perceive that those activities, and women perceive that those activities outside the relationship can no longer be followed up on because of the demands of the family obligations? That's what we're looking at in this particular situation. And so let's take a look. The results were curvilinear here. Let's look on the far right. Notice the dotted lines are the high avoidant people, and the solid lines are the low avoidant people. And on the right, we see that people who are high in avoidance, the dotted lines, start off higher in symptom levels. This is depression, okay? And then they gradually increase. They become more and more depressed as time goes on, as their outside activities are interfered with by their family obligations. Notice people low avoidance start off at a lower level and they actually decline over time. So they're not showing any particular problematic trend. If we look to the left side, if we look at the left side, the low partner interference or the low interference condition, again, you see that people who are avoidant start at a little bit higher level, but they don't show an upward trend at all. And people who are low in avoidance start out a little lower and they show a downward trend with just a hint of an upturn at 24 months. So basically the problematic group are the avoidant people, and on the right side of the graph, on the right side of this figure, who the dotted lines, the avoidant people, feel like they've got their outside activities are being interfered with. They get more and more depressed as time goes by. Okay. So that's the end of that particular section of what I wanted to say, and now I want to switch from marital problems and depression to personal growth. Now, personal growth, we've talked about before, but when I think about personal growth, I find it to be a kind of a slippery concept. It's kind of hard to figure out what personal growth is entirely and to give it a perfectly adequate definition of it. To try to figure out what personal growth was, I asked one of my colleagues who's a humanistic psychologist, and then I asked another of my colleagues who was an existential psychologist, and then I asked another of my colleagues who was a neo-Freudian psychotherapist, and they all had entirely different answers, okay? So there was no agreement on what personal growth was across these things. So that brings me then to attachment theory. What does attachment theory say personal growth is? And it actually says it's a lot of things, but centrally, at the core, personal growth is the decline in avoidance and the decline in anxiety. If you're declining in both of those things, you are growing personally. You're developing greater capacity for relationships and greater capacity for mental health. Okay, so working with the same data set, we ask, how could change take place? I'm going to add that we only studied the change in avoidance. We're studying change in anxiety. We don't have our results yet, so I'm not going to talk about that at all. Only avoidance. So what theory can we apply? What would make people change? Well, we go back to Bowlby, the originator of all this work, and Bowlby has a theory based on inconsistencies. It is kind of a cognitive consistency model. And what he says is that first of all, you have your basic underlying attitudes, values, expectations, cognitions, emotions that underlie avoidant behavior. On the other hand, you have behavior itself. It could be the behavior of the person. It could be the behavior of their partner. Sometimes the behavior and the underlying values, etc., cognitions, emotions, are inconsistent with one another. What's an example of that? Well, avoidant people don't like to be caregivers. That's a very strong characteristic of them. Nevertheless, occasionally they do give care. In other words, occasionally they act like they're not avoidant people. So then you have a conflict. I'm an avoidant person. I feel this way about caregiving. I gave a lot of care anyway. The other thing where you can have inconsistencies is expectations of the partner. Avoidant people do not expect their partners to be very supportive, but what if they are? Suddenly you have an avoidant person whose expectations are violated. What happens to them then? We think that when these expectations are violated, there's a motive to resolve the conflict, and the conflict is resolved in part by changing your level of avoidance. Now, does that theory make any sense? Does it hold water? Does the data support it? Yes, it does. Let's first of all look at the first hypothesis is that perceiving that you have given support to your partner would lead to decreases in avoidance. Okay, does that make sense? Everybody clear? Good. Does that happen? Yes, it does. Let's look at let's try to get oriented here. On the left side, the y-axis, we have avoidance scores. On the x-axis at the bottom, we have what we call prior phase and then next phase. Remember, our study goes in phases. We go from birth to 6 months, 6 months to 12 months. So we're looking at the average of the prior phase's effect on the subsequent phases. And we're looking not just at avoidance, but we're looking at change in avoidance. Okay? So we're saying, does giving support at time 1 make you less avoidant at time 2? And that's sort of the logic of this particular analysis. If you look at the blue line, okay, you'll notice that's the people who do give lots of support, or some support at least, and notice that they're declining in their avoidance, all right? So that there's a small decline. Notice that if you see your partner needing help, and you don't give help, that's the red line, you get more avoidant. You reconsolidate your avoidance and strengthen it, okay? And so this is, I think a very interesting finding to me, because it suggests that you have some control over whether you're an avoidant person or not an avoidant person. You can change yourself. This is the average change per segment. It doesn't show the total change. If you wanted to know the total change, you'd have to add all the segments together. I haven't done that, don't have that with me, so you'll just have to imagine what it might be. The second hypothesis was that if your partner provides a lot of support to you, being inconsistent with avoidant expectations, you should become less avoidant. Sort of the same sort of analysis. And the graph is oriented in the same way, and the blue line means decline in avoidance. And notice that the blue line means that your partner gave you a lot of support. When your partner gives you a lot of support, you become less avoidant. When your partner, however, sees you needing support but doesn't give you any support, you become more avoidant, okay? So again, this sort of consistency notion of Bowlby's seems to carry some weight, and it does seem to actually describe the results that we found. So those are the only two analyses that I have about personal growth, but I think they're interesting ones. I do want to mention a potential boundary condition. We ask ourselves the question, would we get as much change in avoidance if we were doing this study outside of the transition to parenthood at a more normal period of time? Well, we're not sure we would because of this. In order for inconsistencies to make a difference, they have to be noticed, number one, and they have to be regarded as important enough to elicit lots of internal processing, number two. That tends to happen when the avoidance system or the attachment system is highly activated, or when it's sort of at the forefront of consciousness. So we feel like one of the things about the transition period is that it does tend to activate the attachment system, and by activating the attachment system should make inconsistencies more potent in terms of producing change. Some things about the attachment system that activate the some things about the transition that activate the attachment system are just the stress of the transition. That stress activates the attachment system. Recognizing that you need support and that your partner needs support, that can activate the system. And last of all, not last of all, but my third example, during the transition, you as a parent may have much more contact with your own parents, and that may raise old attachment issues, old conflicts, old resentments, old whatever, and that should also force the attachment system more towards the forefront of consciousness. Okay, so we think then that because the attachment system is highly activated in the transition, you're going to get more change in the transition than you would under other circumstances. Okay. Third part of my study, or third part of my presentation, is new directions. My partner and I have been working on the disorganized attachment style, and what that is, well, let me go back. Let's think first of all about Phil Shaver, who developed the original attachment style questionnaire. What did Phil do? You know, he's saying, what's attachment style look like in adults in romantic relationships? So what did Phil do to answer that question? Well, he first of all went back to what we knew about attachment styles in infants. And he saw, well, here's the avoidant infant. This is what the avoidant infant does. What would an avoidant adult look like based on what the avoidant infant looked like? Does that make sense? And then he did the same thing for an anxious infant. Developed a description of an anxious adult based on what he knew from about anxious infants. So we did the same thing. We tried to figure out what it was that a disorganized infant would look like when they became an adult, if they were a disorganized adult. So disorganized, what does that mean? All right, well, the definition is that when you're disorganized, you have no consistent or organized strategy for dealing with distress. You just don't know what to do. What are some of the signs of disorganization with infants in a strange situation? This is the kind of behaviors we were trying to imagine as adults. Well, disorganized infants do things like wandering around. All right, they don't go to their mothers when they're distressed. They wander around aimlessly. They show signs of fear of their mothers or their fathers, whoever happens to be the adult present. They show freezing and stilling behaviors, which in the animal kingdom is interpreted as fear, and which is being interpreted as a sign of fear here in these infants. They engage in just odd postures and mistimed movements, just look like they're somehow out of kilter in some way or other, that they're just don't know what to do, don't know how to, and they're just distracted in some very odd way. So all of these things occur I think the most critical is that signs of fear of their caregivers, because when we ask what causes disorganized attachment to develop, in terms of proximal causes, it just appears that the proximal cause of disorganization is that you're afraid of your parent. Because the parent has been abusive, for example, or the parent has in other ways been frightening to you. Think about this. You're an infant, you're distressed. What does your attachment system tell you to do? The attachment system tells you to go to your caregiver, all right? But on the other hand, what does your experience tell you to do? It tells you stay away from your experience. So they're caught in this approach avoidance conflict, and that's where the disorganization sort of arises. They don't know, they have no solution. This is often called fear without solution. There's nothing they can do to relieve their fear. Okay, distal causes of disorganization are things like child abuse. Disorganization is more common in samples that include lots of people in poverty, and grossly inadequate institutional care has also been linked to disorganized attachment, and there are other things as well, but those are enough examples to give you a feeling for this. Okay, so the idea was to develop a scale for disorganized attachment, and we did so by focusing on things that we thought were focused around fear, because we thought that would be the central concept for adults. So we focus our questions on fear, danger, distrust, and confusion, which we thought the approach avoidance conflict would leave us with a lot of confusion. So here are some example items. It's normal to have traumatic experiences with romantic partners. Notice the fear element there. It is dangerous to trust romantic partners. The fear element here again. And on the confusion side, I feel very confused about romantic relationships. This is a 9-item scale. These are 3 of the key items on the scale. So what do we do with this scale? Well, we've done several different things. I want to talk about one study that we did. It was with a large community sample. Key thing here, these are people who are not going through the transition. We're going to look at their results and say, how could that apply to the transition? Okay, so what do we find? I'm just going to give you 4 simple, straightforward findings that we think would indicate that the disorganization should be relevant to the transition. One of those findings is that disorganized people self-report more violent behavior when they're in conflict with their partners. Disorganized people report more verbal aggression when they're in conflict with their partners. Disorganized people report generally more anxious and aggressive motivations towards their partner. And finally, disorganized people report high levels of anger at their romantic partners. What's interesting about this is to link this back to childhood, because disorganized children in middle childhood show a lot of externalizing, angry, aggressive behavior. So we're seeing in adults the same thing you see in children who are disorganized. And that's very gratifying to me. So how does this all link back to the transition to parenthood? Well, focusing on this anger avoidant thing, partners of more disorganized people may be more likely to be physically abused or verbally abused during the transition. Even if there's no abuse, living with a disorganized person might be highly stressful. Couples involving more disorganized members may engage in highly dysfunctional conflict resolution. And finally, and maybe perhaps the most troubling, is the possibility that disorganized people may be more aggressive towards their infants. So, let's summarize. 3 points. Avoidance and anxiety are not inevitably linked to marital dissatisfaction and depression. They are linked only when the wrong circumstances prevail in their relationships. Number 2, we and our partners can affect change in our levels of avoidance. And number 3, the disorganized attachment style may predict severe problems in relationships during the transition period. So thank you very much. That's what I have for you.